Well, joining us now to break this down is Gerard Filitti. He's senior counsel at the Lawfare Project. So break down this scheme for us. How would this actually work in theory?
First, thank you so much for having me. How this scheme would work in theory is that people seeking asylum or refugee status, once they arrive in Denmark, once they arrive in the UK under that scheme, they would essentially be put on planes and sent to Rwanda, where they would undergo the asylum system, where they would make their applications there for refugee status. And if it's granted, they would either be directed to resettle in the UK, in Denmark, in a third country potentially, or given the chance also to remain in Rwanda. So essentially, it's shifting the problem away from detention centers and courts within Denmark to centers that will be set up in Rwanda.
Now, this sounds extremely inhumane, since we can only assume that most people who come to Denmark for asylum will not agree to go to Rwanda instead of that. And the question, of course, is where they'll be living, what the process is going to be like that they're going through. Break down the risks of outsourcing Denmark's asylum process for us.
Well, there are a few risks, but one thing that needs to be remembered is Rwanda is a country that has its own history of civil and human rights abuses. It's hardly a perfect society, and sending people, asylum seekers by definition are people who have left their country because they are unable to live there because of persecution or harm, the fear of serious harm that they may encounter there because of their race, their religion, their membership in a social group or a protected social status. They're leaving their countries, making the journey to Denmark, the United Kingdom, and other places because of the serious risk for harm. And instead of being greeted and sheltered and given, triage, and those with legitimate claims for asylum retained there, they're being shipped by plane thousands of miles away to a country that has a different language, a different cultural system, a different climate than anything they've experienced, all because it's not expedient to do this in Denmark. Now, to put this in context, what the Danish government should be looking at is the issue of illegal immigrants, of the people who come, the migrants who come there taking job opportunities. Refugees are only a small number of the migrants who come to Denmark, but the Danish government is creating this hassle for them, which is really traumatizing considering everything they've gone to leave their countries.
Right, and that is what I want to ask next, is how many asylum seekers actually make their way to Denmark every year? How big of an issue is this?
Well, it's a slightly different. It's a little bit difficult to give you the exact numbers today because we have two things. We've had a decline in the number of refugees and migrants because of COVID, but now we have an upsurge because of the situation in Ukraine. So for the first 5 months of this year, there were 2,700 refugees from countries that were not Afghanistan or Ukraine, and 27,000 refugee seekers from Ukraine. Now, when you're coming from a country like Ukraine or Afghanistan, there are agreements in place internationally to take in a number of asylum seekers, a number of refugees. That's really outside the scope of what the Danish government is doing. They're looking at that number, the 5,000 to 6,000 people a year who come to seek asylum or who seek refugee status.
Well, the question is, are there any other countries that have actually outsourced their asylum processes to date? Obviously, we heard the UK discussing this. We even heard Israel discussing this at a certain point.
Well, that's exactly right. Other countries have discussed it, but no one has implemented it. In England, they tried doing this. Prime Minister Boris Johnson tried doing this famously at the beginning of the summer. And there was, at the end of the day, out of a plane load of people that he wanted to be the first ones to send to Rwanda, there were 6 people left on the plane, and even those were not allowed to be sent because of court challenges. So we can expect that there will be significant legal challenges within the European Union, within Danish courts, within British courts, for anyone who tries to sustain the system and actually implement it. It's not a realistic system to implement. And quite frankly, the one parallel that comes to mind is the United States with detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Instead of bringing them into the United States for trial, we kept them in Guantanamo in Cuba. This seems to be a very cynical ploy by the Danish government and the British government to shift problems to another country and not claim responsibility for them as they should under international agreements.
Quick answer to this: is passing this policy make or break for the politicians who are trying to get elected in Denmark? How much do they care about this? And how much does the Danish public care about this?
I think the Danish public does care tremendously about the problems of migration, but they care about the illegal migration, the people who come just because they want a better life, not because they're in danger of losing their lives. So the issue, making this a problem about refugees, is a non-starter. It's cheap political, but it doesn't solve the problem.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, Gerard. Obviously, you know, this is really just a terrifying story, and we're going to have to wait and see if any of these politicians actually pull the plug and get this going.